outlining a few parts of the debate. First, compulsory voting should be understood as obligatory under law. In this case, an obligation to go to the polls. Second, the scope of this debate shall focus on voting in the United States at the federal level. Lastly, given that the United States government is a federal republic, one that is governed by elected representatives, the affirmative will prove that compulsory voting laws enable citizens to better elect representatives. Therefore, it is the negative's burden to prove that maintaining the citizen's choice to vote or not to vote makes the government more representative of the population. We present two main points in support of the affirmative case. First, political agency. Second, representation. Contention 1, compulsory voting increases political agency. If you were to knock on the door of a random house in a random street in the United States and ask a random person if they voted for Donald Trump, chances are they would say no. That's because 3 in 4 Americans did not cast a vote for our sitting president. In fact, overall voter turnout dropped to its lowest point in decades, with only 55% of voting-age citizens casting ballots in the 2016 election. Unfortunately, this is not a snapshot view, but an indicator of an ongoing trend of disengagement that has far-reaching impacts. Many political scientists attribute this result to non-participating Americans perceiving voting as inaccessible to them. Many citizens will not vote because they never feel confident enough to do so. Making voting compulsory would directly counteract this problem. Citizens, particularly those who have become habitually disengaged with the political system, become invigorated with agency under a system of compulsory voting. Dr. Emily Chapman, assistant professor of political science at Stanford University, contends that knowing that they will be called upon to actively participate on a recurring basis provides citizens with a reason to develop an enduring political identity. This political identity will go on to change the attitude of our citizenry, particularly those who have not otherwise participated in the political system, ultimately spilling up to create a better democracy. These results are not just theoretical, but have been empirically proven in other countries that have adopted compulsory voting laws. Not only are people given agency, but are also more engaged in a society under a system of compulsory voting. Research has found that long-term exposure to compulsory voting increased citizens' level of attention to the news, particularly political news, as well as their political interest in measures of objective knowledge. Jill Shepherd, a political science at the Australian National University, surveyed data from 133 elections in 47 countries and found that compulsory voting incentivizes self-education and civic engagement across gender and educational backgrounds. Furthermore, compulsory laws trigger a broader shift in attitudes towards voting. Many countries, such as Australia, have found that since compulsory voting laws were put in place in 1924, overall turnout has never dipped below 90%. Citizens have noted the tangible effects of voting laws in their livelihood. The New York Times interviewed an Australian citizen who described voting in Australia like a party. Quote, "There's a barbecue at the local school. Everyone turns up, everyone votes. There's a sense that we're all in this together. We're all affected by the decision we make today." End quote. Domestically, we should expect to see the same results, ultimately leading to a more engaged and educated population that will create a long-lasting shift in the attitude of the American people. Contention 2, compulsory voting leads to better representation. Because of compulsory voting, a greater percentage of the population will cast their ballots, resulting in elected officials being held accountable to all of their constituents, not just the selected population that votes in a voluntary system. According to Dr. Shane Singh, professor of international affairs at the University of Georgia, mandatory electoral participation represents the quickest and most reliable method of raising the turnout rate. Not only is increasing the number of voters an inherently good press towards a truly representative democracy, but it also energizes the nature of voting. Dr. Singh goes on to explain that compulsory voting changes the character of the voting population and the incentives provided to politicians seeking voter support. Such a dynamic may be accompanied by important social, economic, and political consequences. This result is especially important, considering that a large portion of non-voters come from marginalized groups. After the 2010 Supreme Court Citizens United decision, the working class and impoverished have had their voices drowned out by massive amounts of money being funneled into politics. Voter turnout is lowest where poverty rates are highest because people feel disenfranchised with limited financial resources. But members of politically alienated groups have more reason to regard their vote as an instrument of political influence if they know that others like them will also vote. Mandatory voting evens out disparities stemming from income, education, and age, enhancing our system's inclusiveness. Studies have historically shown that compulsory voting reduces income inequality and corruption because it incentivizes disillusioned voters to go to the polls and vote against improbity. Moreover, politicians' behavior and motivations change as well. Because candidates must now persuade all constituents that they will be forced to address broader concerns rather than appealing to narrow bases. The result will be a push towards the middle in policies, reducing polarization and making for a better functioning system. These fundamental changes in the way in which our democracy operates encourages leaders to propose, discuss, and implement policies that are more representative of the needs of the American population. Thus, we are proud to affirm.
Ready for cross-examination?
Yeah, let me just grab some water really quickly.
Of course.
Whenever you're ready.
Great. What enforcement mechanism do you use to ensure that people actually vote?
So our mechanism is kind of modeled a little bit off of some of the states in Austria. So what happens is that the federal government will set like a maximum amount of like fines. So it's only civil penalties, and then states are given the choice to define what those fines are on a state-by-state basis. But the fines are adjusted to a socioeconomic status based on like socioeconomic similar to taxes.
Okay.
But
I just wanted to make sure it still fines.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You say the scope of this resolution should be federal elections. Is that federal general elections alone?
We would say like, yeah, we're focusing on federal elections, but like, yeah, federal general elections.
Yes, that was the question. So the presidential and the midterm in November. Great. You cite in a couple of cases the Australia compulsory vote model is a good model. Do you have any evidence on how that came about, who pushed for it in Australia?
I'm not aware of who pushed for it, but I think that any sort of evidence that contextualizes it must represent what happened in 1924, how that political system changed, and who those political parties were at that time compared to.
All right, we will provide that evidence. Let's talk about representation. You said representation should be the primary good of the government. Why?
It should be what?
The primary good of the government. Why?
So we think the United States is founded on this like idea of representation of the people. The reason why the United States split from Britain is because there was a government without representation.
The United States is also predicated on other ideas. For example, the maintenance of slavery. In the start of the colonies, a majority of Americans favored the perpetuation of slavery. Would that have been a good of the government if it's representative of the people?
So we think that clearly there are differences between slavery and having people's voices heard. So like in an instance of which like we're comparing like why representativeness is good but slavery is bad, we see that representativeness would inherently say that slavery is bad because slaves would be equally representative in the government.
Let's say that 90% of Americans favor something like a ban on the Muslim religion in the United States. Is that something the government should pursue because the majority of citizens support it?
So I think that that's a perfect example about the other mechanisms of the government that would prevent such policies.
Okay,
like the First Amendment. So the Constitution works to prevent violent ideologies, as well as like electoral colleges, like the electoral college that prevents like such.
Okay, we'll move on from there. Why is political agency good?
Political agency is a prerequisite into like having the ability to like access freedom of choice. So if somebody feels as though the voting system is not accessible to them because they are like excluded from it, they're not making the free choice to participate or not to participate. So everyone must have agency before we can even think about things such as freedom or whether or not, you know, like people have equal access to democracy.
Okay. Why is voting important, right? Or why is representation within government important?
So representation is important because one, we outline like generally the government should be representative of people for what we discussed earlier.
Okay.
Secondly, we isolate a particular group of like marginalized people whose voices are not heard and whose voices particularly do not vote because of the issues of like agency and other issues that the affirmative outlined.
Got it. And if those people are represented, that's good because it leads to representative policies, correct?
Correct.
Can you provide your evidence on why you say studies indicate that there's less income inequality with higher turnout? Can you cite those studies?
Yeah, so what we get this evidence from Professor William Galston, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, who has historically studied different countries across the world.
Okay, do you have a methodology for any of those studies you'd like to compare?
So we would say that, yeah, I can pull that up if you want the 27 seconds.
Okay, we'll just grab it before the next speech if that's all right.
Okay.
Is a representative democracy okay? If Congress is representative of the people, is it okay that Congress and not like literally everybody votes on a particular policy?
Yeah, so as I outlined at the top of the speech, our government is one of a federal republic, which means that we elect leaders to make decisions on behalf of the people.
Okay.
Therefore, we're not advocating for citizens to vote on every sort of tax bill, but to better elect representatives that can make the best decisions for them.
Thank you.
It's fine, actually, don't do that.
Okay.
All right. I might actually go speak from up there if that's cool. Or is it? Yeah. Sweet. Bye.
A little bit.
All right. Is everyone ready? Cool. We'll begin. Because the right to vote includes the right to abstain, we negate the resolution that voting should be compulsory in the United States. We begin with an observation. In order to formulate a theory of government obligations, it is necessary to understand its function, which means we need to know how philosophically it came to be in the first place. Now our theory of the state. First, freedom is the primary moral good because freedom is what makes us moral agents. And to pursue any good is to value the freedom that enables you to pursue that good in the first place. Further, freedom is a property of action, not something that you can add up with in a state of affairs. Therefore, this framework is not a question of whether the plan results in more or less freedom, but whether compulsory voting is internally consistent with freedom. Second, rights exist in the state of nature, but they're not secure. Barton explains that we need a higher authority to govern public interactions so that we don't have to worry about constant violations. But third, because the state exists to preserve equal freedom, the only proper function of the state is to secure negative rights against interference. The state can prevent individuals from violating each other's rights, but any further interference is a violation by the state and unjust. Because A, if the state can restrict freedom in one particular situation, it can always argue that situation exists, creating a state of exception and justifying infinite rights violations. But B, non-minimalist governments impose a conception of the good of the citizens rather than allowing them to freely choose their own. Compulsory voting then, we argue, will exceed the authority of the minimal state for two reasons. First, non-voting is a negative right. Law professor Jeffrey Bloomberg explains that abstaining is a valid exercise of the right to vote, recognized by the 4th and 5th Circuit, as well as implied by Reynolds v. Smith. Think about it through the simple analogy. We have the freedom of speech, but we also have the freedom to not speak. But secondly, compulsory voting forces an implicit endorsement of the government. Anna Lever of the London School of Economics writes that even if we have a moral obligation to vote a particular way in a particular election, it will always be situational. You can't justify an absolute duty to vote. For example, plenty of citizens have valid, well-reasoned desire to abstain. Jehovah's Witnesses don't vote for a matter of religion. Some Native Americans don't vote because they perceive the United States as their land. Some trans individuals might not vote because they perceive the United States as transphobic. And famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison wrote that knowing the pro-slavery compromise contained in the Constitution, we refuse to touch the ballot, stained as it is with the blood of 4 million slaves. The next argument that we'd like to make talks about polarization. There were 3 ways a shift to a compulsory voting system would increase political polarization. First, media madness. Lecturer of George Mason University in 2012 writes that news organizations are moving away from horse race coverage and the status quo. But Hershey of Indiana University 2002 explains that a change in the electoral rules would invite a new level of strategic coverage, the fight to pass compulsory voting and the implications that change would have on the ongoing supply of material. And horse race journalism creates a polarized electorate because the media focuses on heated and divisive parts of politics rather than actual issues. Lewandowski of Penn University quantifies that this horse race media coverage, essentially covering who's winning an election and what the system is, increases polarization 44%. Or second warrant is obligation. Ritchie of the University of Sao Paulo in 2016 explains that compulsory voting makes voters reevaluate their preferences and pursue abstract moral characteristics. Subsequently, she finds in an empirical study that when there is a transition away from a compulsory system to a mandatory system, charisma becomes twice as likely to become the most important characteristic to voters. When a notable portion of voters are more sensitive to ideological campaigning, candidates respond by using ideological narrow policies and becoming polarized. Additionally, you're going to prefer the Ritchie evidence over the Chapman evidence that they read on case, because the Chapman evidence is simply an editorial, one individual writer making an opinion. Ritchie actually conducted empirical research, so you always are going to prioritize the research. But thirdly, partisan backlash. Heron of the University of Kansas explains in 2002 that because electoral change may advantage or disadvantage some parties, parties are risk averse to change. Gaines of the University of Illinois finds in 2010 that any electoral reform supported by mostly one party would ignite intense opposition in an attempt to skew future elections. Because many scholars predict that compulsory voting would be pro-Democrat, the GOP would likely use this change as an excuse to intense instructionism in order to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of government under the new system. The impact is worse policies. Epstein of Rand Corporation finds that at high levels of polarization, the government passes 144% fewer policies. Now go to my opponent's case. they say that the goal of government is to be representative, but we show that that goal is not absolute, and that representative legislator doesn't actually equate to representative policies. So, but then, even if you wanted to believe that it's representative policies, you can turn the argument against them right there. In fact, an ABC News poll found that 72% of Americans oppose compulsory voting. If you prioritize representative policies, this is not a representative policy. But secondly, when we asked why Australia had a compulsory voting system, my opponents were unable to give me an answer. This is really important because Tietze explains that compulsory voting is an elitist response to a deeper crisis that imposes an extremely narrow and atomized form of politics. In Australia specifically, it was the pro-conservative party as a means to get rid of the labor union's impact that resulted in worse rights for individual voters. Essentially, their view that the government is the be-all, end-all, ignores systematic problems. Additionally, they don't also solve for a lot of these systematic barriers that affect representation, like the primary process, or a lot of other things such as gerrymandering. At the point where they don't solve for any of that, it probably results in a worse outcome. And then, all of their arguments about voter turnout is low. That's not happening in the status quo. The Brookings Institution finds that particularly minority voters are increasing at a faster rate in comparison to white voters, so the electorate is more representative than ever. But secondly, Jameson Brennan explains that the people who vote and the people who don't vote have the same ideological preferences. At the point where that is true, we would say that there's no difference in representation, there's no effect on policy. But thirdly, you turn the argument because James Notre of Princeton University explains that increasing voter turnout raises peripheral voters, voters that are disinterested in the political process. These individual voters are more likely to vote against their own interests. So when they talk about income inequality, if you have people turning out to the polls but don't go vote against their own interests, that is an on-net worse policy. But fourthly, the University of Georgia, their own author actually finds that you increase misinformation and also you increase the amount of people who vote off of this misinformation, so you have a worse quality of the electorate. Yeah.
So let's talk with your polarization. You use evidence from 2002, but how does this take into account the fact that media is already like the most polarized that we've ever seen before?
So we say that there's a change like systematically in the news media away from this horse race coverage due to like declining profits, so that they're focusing more on issues.
So given that that is in 2002 and now we see
it was
more
2012.
Okay, so 7 years later where we have Donald Trump as president, and there's more money in politics than ever, there's more horse race journalism, how is it possible that like the Affirmative could make this any worse? Like literally Donald Trump is our president.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things. That just because Donald Trump is the president, that doesn't mean that the media is entirely sensationalized. And we would contend through another analysis that we can bring up more recently is that they're shifting away from this horse race coverage in the long term, right? And if anything, it's a sliding scale impact. So even if it's bad right now, it can always get worse.
So the Affirmative has presented reasons why people don't vote, such as like structural barriers and feeling as though it's inaccessible to them. While the negative has like painted this picture that people that don't vote are now just gonna be swayed by like charisma politics and aren't smart enough to make the best decisions for themselves. How can you justify this sort of like presentation of like non-voters and say that they like are gonna lead to worse policies?
Our evidence is not even just specific to non-voters, it's all voters in general. So even voters who have already voted, the Singh evidence, which is like what you cited, actually finds that even all voters, when they are forced to vote, they seek out less information, and so this is probably just results in a worse outcome. And actually, going back to your response, can I respond to horse race coverage real quick again?
Well, we're just gonna move on just in the interest of time. But also, like, if that is true, then why is it good to have like white educated voters be choosing the decisions of like of the outcomes of policies? Like, if everyone makes poor decisions, why shouldn't we encourage like non-voters too?
So we try to explain that that trend is shifting away in the status quo, with the Brookings Institution finds that there's a higher percentage of minority voters turning out to the polls and changing demographics.
That's not what the evidence
leads
says.
To more representation.
Your evidence says that more minorities are increasing their percentage at a faster rate. But if they're going from 20% to 25%, while white people are still voting 65%, that's not the same.
Right, no, but the Brennan evidence of Georgetown University, the next piece of evidence we read, is that this electorate is actually representative of the general population. And that's why we talked about like the difference between, why don't we have a direct democracy? It's because we elect representatives who are representative of everyo's interests, and the status quo is currently that.
If it is true that the status quo does not represent the people's interests, doesn't that get if that is true, then isn't there only a risk that the Affirmative makes it better?
No, so there's a couple of problems. First, you don't read any sort of like qualified evidence that indicates that the status quo is not representative. You just say that there's less turnout. Just because that there is less turnout, that doesn't mean that the status quo is more representative. Additionally, we contend that the status quo is getting more representative, and the Brennan evidence would contend that it is representative. That people like vote against their own party interests.
Let's move on to your framing. So can you sum up, like, I don't understand why, like, compulsory voting must be, like, obvious, like, absolutely equated with freedom.
Right, so we
Like,
just
if
talked
there-
about, we need to have a fundamental theory of moral obligations of the state due to the nature of the resolution. So philosophy comes first, and so we give a lot of reasons as to
So
how
why
the state
should
came into
philosophy
being.
come first when, like, a single mother that can't access the polls because of, like, because of structural issues, why should we focus on, like, the
So I
philosophy
guess two
behind
things.
these policies?
So first of all, you probably don't solve for a lot of those issues because at the point where the systems such as gerrymandering, as well as other things such as the primary process means that representation doesn't automatically go up. But secondly, you should prioritize political philosophy because political events change, right? It's the idea that the founders could not have predicted high levels of polarization 300 years ago. So they implement a political philosophy that can be universalizable across many generations.
So,
and
like,
elections.
but, like, back to, like, the original process, this political philosophy that institutes, like, on the basis of, like, racism and ignoring minority voices, I don't
Right.
understand
So-
why that
so
should
first of all-
possibly, like, outweigh, like, status quo issues.
So first of all, we pretend that's not true, but secondly, it's better to not, or to protect freedom.
Is anyone not ready?
Oh, we're good.
A representative government that does not represent the people is a farce. What the opposition here tells you is that a couple of things. One, that the government is representative of the people now. This is a complete misunderstanding. If that's true, then that would mean, one, identity would be represented equally, which it is not. We think that when females vote more than men in certain districts, and yet their districts don't see an increased amount of female voters proportional to the amount of people voting, that's not representative in terms of identity. When we see African Americans proportionally disadvantaged in Congress and not represented to the length of what they are in the populace, that's not representative. What we tell you is that people are locked out of the system, not just because of race or identity, but because of their socioeconomic status, because of money, because of structural barriers in place that prevent them from voting. You should weigh what the freedom that we give to these people and what they're enabled to find agency and become representative against any of the harms that they're trying to contain. So first, we're going to start with the first contention. Compulsory voting increases political agency. In the status quo, there are many people that are disengaged and disenfranchised with the system. People do not think they can be part of the process, so they don't get involved. This is bad because people having agency is the prerequisite for freedom. These people see that they can't access the system, and thus their freedom is inhibited. What this means is that compulsory voting is meant to balance the inequalities of freedom across the system. First, making compulsory voting counters this problem. Dr. Chapman's research, not just an editorial from the previous speech, indicates that people will, quote, develop an enduring political identity, end quote, which leads to an attitudinal shift of the citizenry by, quote, manifesting the equal authority of all citizens, end quote. We tell you that this is empirically proven. The two pieces of evidence introduced in the previous speech, one by Princeton Center for the Study of Democratic Politics and the other by Jill Shepard, indicates that long-term exposure to compulsory voting increased voters' knowledge. When comparing election data between countries that have compulsory voting and those who do not, systems of compulsory voting incentivizes self-education and civic engagement. This leads to a shift in the attitude of how people view politics, and that's a net increase in not only education, but engagement within the system. Our second contention is that compulsory voting leads to better representation. First, on the theoretical level, representatives are meant to be representative of the entire people. You can look to the work I did above at the start of the speech. Without representation, the voices of the people are lost and not heard. We must level the playing field and enable a system that balances the inequalities of freedom. The words of Dr. Singh in the previous speech are excellent. First, only mandatory voting can achieve the optimal turnout rate necessary for true representation. Second, compulsory voting incentivizes politicians to reach out across the spectrum and take into account a much broader range of interests. This is how Dr. Singh concludes. What he does is recognizing some of the opponent's arguments is what they brought up, but he concludes in our favor, which means you should not count, you should weigh that against what they're trying to say that he's actually saying. This is especially true for marginalized groups. These people are drowned out. Professor Galson at the Brookings Institute, quote, says that, quote, mandatory voting, quote, evens out the disparities stemming from income, education, and age, end quote, thus enhancing inclusiveness. This provides uniqueness evidence that they tell you that, when this counteracts their evidence saying that the model is not representative now. This inclusivity results in a push towards the middle. What they tell you is that there's going to be this polarization. No. We tell you that when there's more people in the system, that's going to even out the disparities of the race to the polls. And when I say polls, I mean poles of the spectrum. What we see in the status quo is only appealing to the base. The base is the most energized, and the base is the people that go out and vote. What we tell you is that the people that are most disengaged are actually the moderates, not the base. Because and when you introduce this voting, representatives have the electoral incentive to cater to these interests. That's our Dr. Singh evidence from the previous speech. And what this means is that the decrease in you'll see a decrease in polarization, not an increase. And what we tell you is that Andres Lizeo, the research chair of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences Center for Social Sciences, says that populists win because of non-participation, and compulsory voting is the silver bullet, quote. Mandatory voting could be a potential silver bullet to dethrone autocratic populists. Mandatory voting would also be a game changer to counterbalance asymmetries caused by government control, media, and distorted campaign finance structures, end quote. So what we tell you is that populism and this polarization all happens in the status quo. The drowning out happens in the status quo. They offer no alternative but to tell you that you should weigh the freedom of special interests against this. What we tell you is that you should weigh the freedom of the people that are disengaged from the system, which is a larger majority of the people that would have the freedom inhibited. And additionally, so just like on some of their stuff here, they tell you that there's going to be like this GOP backlash. We tell you that no, this electoral reform isn't going to be supported by any one party. Alan Greenspan tells you that you can't predict how the electoral outcomes are how they're going to be favored, and you can't predict how these voters are going to vote, which means the GOP won't see it as a net Democratic gain. Additionally, they tell you that there's 144% fewer policies when the system is polarized. We tell you the system is polarized now. Only 2% of current legislation that's introduced in Congress actually gets passed. Which this means there's only a chance there's only a risk that the affirmative solves and makes it better because you include more people. Going on to free speech. We think that the definition of free speech provided by them is simply wrong. What they tell you is that you can decide to not engage with the system itself. By the definition of their speech, you don't have to interact with the government. What's stopping you from speeding past the cop and not stopping? What's stopping you from not having to show up to jury duty? We tell you that there are certain things that you have to do, and freedom is already inhibited. There's no impact to going on to this. Additionally, if we win the structural obstacles in the scope preventing people from voting now, then there's only risk the act makes this better and decreases the obstruction of free speech. There are people now who want to vote but cannot. This is a direct infringement on free speech. Equal access to voting is a prerequisite to identifying other forms of free speech. The present is not working. They tell you that there's this additionally, we tell you the model solves. You can show up to the vote. You could show up and submit a blank ballot. That's what they do in Austria. That's what they do in Australia. We're not forcing you to vote for a specific candidate or a specific policy. You can submit a blank ballot.
Are you ready?
Yep.
So let me start by asking about, you talked about how there are specific marginalized populations that don't have the capacity to vote under the current system. So in Alabama, when Roy Moore had his scandal go on, right, what was the primary demographic that was involved with turning out to the polls to oppose them?
I mean, I'm not sure on the specifics of Alabama.
Okay, it was African American women, right? So why can't the current system prohibit this? Like, why can't mobilization and get out the vote initiatives stop this without the mandation of compulsion?
So I would argue against that. I would say a lot of Republicans actually defected against Roy Moore because they were disgusted by the acts that had him. So there was the hardcore Republicans that stuck with him, but there were also Republicans that voted against him.
Okay, so
like it's not just African American women. We tell you that in the status quo, the government is not representative of the people.
If anything, we would contend they stayed home. But I guess the next question now is when we talk specifically about these marginalized populations, if you go back to the era of slavery, right? So like, don't marginalized populations have a vested interest if both candidates, both the Republican and Democratic candidate, was specifically for slavery, right? Isn't non-voting in that specific instance an instance of where individuals are expressing their rights, particularly these marginalized bodies that you talk about?
This is what we tell you. They were not able to have their voice in the system. They were deemed as property, and what that happens is by the framing of your debate. You say that you should only weigh the freedom, you shouldn't weigh like these consequences. What we tell you is that when you look at only the special interests and you don't allow these people to have a voice in the system, i.e. when slaves are deemed as property by these special interests because they don't have access to the system to voice their opinion, these are the net bad policies that result from just looking at.
But the only way that you solve, I guess, then is through the utilization of the state as a mechanism and the idea that it's like the government, right? It's the end all be all, and that elections can result in these solutions to a lot of these
We tell you that compulsory voting leads to a shift in the voting in the attitudinal shift of not only the citizenry, but how voting is conducted. We tell you that the barriers are going to be removed. For instance, if you have to mandate voting, there's no longer longer going to be unconstitutional voter roll purges and the such because they have to vote. Like you can't.
So how does
strict
the affirmative
enforcement
address gerrymandering?
So we tell you a few things. One, gerrymandering happens right now, and it's the reason why representatives doesn't occur. And two, we tell you that when these people are going to have to now engage in the system, they're going to realize the true extent of the issue, and they're going to vote out the state legislators that put the gerrymandering in place because they realize that these people are trying to harm them. And two, we think it leads to this educational shift, which is what our first contention is about. As they gain agency, as they become more self-educated, they're going to learn about the issues and learn how to solve these issues.
Okay.
So we don't think that people are going to be engaged in the system, see that they're being screwed by the system, and not do anything about it.
All right, so I guess next question. So we've had some debate over the Sing evidence. So what year do you cite the Sing evidence? Is it the 2018 study?
I mean, I don't have the specific piece of evidence on me.
I'm just saying, because like we had some disagreements, but I have like the actual like report PDF format. And so you made a claim that the Sing evidence concludes, that like it leads to more representation, but based on the evidence, and I can read it, is that even if compulsory voting, this is the last paragraph, has desirable effects, its moral justifiability remains a subject of dispute, right?
So what we're saying is Dr. Singh is
the other way, right?
No, we're saying that he recognizes that his opponents, and there's a debate about it, but he's advocating for compulsory voting.
Okay,
he's recognizing that there's disputes over it, but he's saying that this leads to more representation.
Okay, cool, that's fine. So I guess the next question is, when we go to the argument of polarization, right? So you say right now that 2% of legislation is passed in the status quo, right? If there's less legislation being passed, right, is that still not a worse thing?
We're saying that when you increase the amount of people voting, these politicians have to cater to these interests. There's going to be policy.
Okay.
That's yours.
I guess I'll move to Yeah. The order is going to be the affirmative case, our second argument, and then our first argument. Everyone ready? Jen? The affirmative says in their second speech, the compulsory voting is a silver bullet. That is the mindset we are trying to argue against. Voting is not the only form of politics, and we should not impose a narrow and atomized form of politics on our citizens. Voting should be maybe part of the solution, but definitely not the whole thing. As an overview, the affirmative terminalizes their impact in representative policies. They say political agency is good because it drives people to the polls, and representation at the polls is good because it leads to more representative policies. That's the only terminal impact coming out of the affirmative case. However, as an overview, representative policies won't result in actually negate. A, you can negate on face because 72% of people oppose compulsory voting. It's not a representative policy, and that's something they never responded to. So as a 100% strength of link, if we're simply looking at representative policies, this isn't one. And if we want to increase turnout, we should do it in a way that people support. So just like that, you can sign your ballot on the affirmative case. But even if you don't buy that, policies still won't be representative. Even if voters are moderates, politicians won't be, because even if you mandate people show up in the general election, the candidates will be chosen in primaries where the voter demographic is more extreme, which means they're going to have two bad options. And C, there's not going to be more representative policy. That's our Brennan evidence that they never directly responded to. They say there's going to be more representation at the polls. We say that doesn't translate into more representative policies because the people who don't vote, their ideological breakdown is about the same as people who do. Now we'll go through the line by line of the argument. They respond to our Brookings evidence saying that identity representation matters. They terminalize this impact, though, to policies. They say we need to represent minorities so that minority-centric policies get passed, which means our Brennan evidence takes this out. they make an argument that agency is a prerequisite to people's freedom. However, we must make a distinction between people who can't engage and people who choose not to engage. This is empirically proven. For example, William Lloyd Garrison, Native Americans, and Jehovah's Witnesses all have the capacity to vote, but they choose to disengage, and we should respect that choice. Finally, they extend their Shepherd evidence, saying it increases knowledge. However, you should prefer our Singh evidence, saying that more people are disinterested because Singh is a study within a particular country, whereas Shepherd crosses borders, is cross-national study, in which case there might be different political cultures in different countries. Now we'll go to the representation argument. Extend our DiNardo evidence, indicating that people are more disinterested when you force them to go to the polls. This holds for both current voters and non-voters. They get less interested when you make voting something you have to do. There are very few people who get excited about jury duty because it's a compulsory government obligation. Finally, they say it will push people towards the middle. However, Brennan evidence indicates that there won't be any policy change. And two, even if non-voters are moderate now, they'll stop being moderate. That's one, our Rizzi evidence indicating when you force people to the polls, they're more subject to ideological appeals and appeals of charisma, meaning they stop being moderate. And two, our DiNardo evidence indicating disinterest causes people to vote against their own interests. This is empirically proven. Late deciding voters broke towards Trump, indicating when you put people in this decision of walking up to the polls, having to choose who to vote for, they're going to vote for a backlash candidate who's against the system that's compelled them to vote in the first place. On the disadvantage, they've made very few arguments, especially against our media madness claim. Extend the media madness claim that horse race journalism is declining now. They say it's non-unique, but our evidence says that since journalism circulation is declining, they're going to have to shift their model. However, the fact that we're passing an entirely new policy with these new consequences means that they're going to have more horse race stuff to produce, leading to more divisive politics. That's our Lewandowski evidence indicating that 44% more polarization will occur. This is a quantifiable impact. Extend our Epstein evidence. They say it's polarized now. However, polarization can always get worse and turn. More polarization now will lead to the worst impacts. Barber contextualizes in 2014 that political polarization causes the government to postpone the handling of important issues, decreasing its ability to deal with longer-term problems such as reform to entitlement and fiscal crises. But now we'll go to the negative case, and this is going to be where we finish off the debate. Extend our evidence to mean a philosophical theory of the government in order to determine what government obligations should be. They push back against this in cross-examination, but never in the speech, so there's no argument within the debate against it, and philosophy has to come first because it's how we determine what policies are good or bad in the first place. Their only responses are, one, jury duty is something that you have to do and you can't opt out of that, but first of all, jury duty is an obligation to a specific person, the defendant, who is guaranteed a right to trial by jury. There is nobody in the Constitution that is guaranteed an electorate in which everyone votes. They're guaranteed an electorate in which everyone has the chance to vote. They make an argument about equal access to voting. However, one, a lot of those laws are getting struck down. For example, the 2016 North Carolina gerrymandering and limited voter turnout law was struck down by a federal court. And second, arguments outweigh because they're intrinsic to compulsory voting. You can imagine a system of non-compulsory voting in which these restrictions don't occur, but you can't imagine a system of compulsory voting that doesn't violate freedom. Finally, they say there's a blank ballot. However, A, this is a new argument. B, they say it exists in Australia, but that is untrue. You can look it up. And third, there are some people like William Lloyd Garrison who reject the ballot in their entirety. So to walk you through the argument, freedom has to be the intrinsic moral good because it's how we select any other moral goods. That means we need a state to secure our freedom. This is important because if the state is contingent on securing freedom, that needs to be its primary goal. That means we need a minimal state. If there's ever a state in which, or a situation in which the government can violate freedom, they can always argue that situation exists. It's low turnout today, it's low representation tomorrow. Who knows what it is in the future? Thank you. Ready for sequence? I'll walk back.
Okay. Ready?
Yep.
So let's start with this framing that you just ended on. The primary goal of the state is to secure freedom, so you need a minimal state. When people don't vote, how is the state securing those people's freedoms?
The state secures freedom by exercising monopoly on force to protect people's right. If I choose not to vote in an election, the state still comes to my house if there's a fire, right? That's the sort of freedom. I still have access to the court system to adjudicate.
Okay, so is the government responsive to voters in general?
Are you talking in the specific or in
no,
the...
like voters vote. Is the government responsive to them?
Generally speaking, yes. I think
So
we
if
debate about whether that's
okay,
the
so if
case in the
certain
United
groups
States.
don't vote, then that means the government is only responsive to the people that do vote.
No, no.
You
For
just said
example-
it's responsive to the voters.
So it's responsive to people who vote on policy. Let's elaborate. In the 2016 the 2016 or various pieces of legislation, the only people who vote on those are the 535 members of Congress and the president, right? But those people are deemed to be representative because we assume that their preferences reflect the preference of people as a whole. Likewise, the subset of people who do vote, our Brennan evidence indicates their preferences are identical to the subset of people who do vote and don't vote as a whole, and you've provided no evidence to indicate there's a difference in preference.
No, hold on. Can we have the warrants of the Brennan evidence? Because there is no way you can predict how the non-voters are going to vote in an election.
So it's survey-based data. If anyone can predict it, I would guarantee it's somebody who's written a 400-page book on the topic. That's Brennan. Compulsory voting for and against, evaluating both sides of the topic. I also think if you want to make a response to the Brennan evidence, it should have arrived earlier in the debate.
Okay, let's talk about, like, you say gerrymandering is being struck down now because the North Carolina, they said that the way the map was drawn was bad. Did North Carolina not redraw the map still gerrymandered?
So when the federal court strikes down,
They strike the way the map was drawn.
yes.
Then it goes back
and
to
then the court redistricts. For example, in Pennsylvania, when the court struck down the 10-3 gerrymandering plan because of clear racial.
Okay, so is
and
gerrymandering
unrepresentative
in Pennsylvania now gone?
Yes, because the court drew the map. That's why 4 new Democratic representatives got elected in Pennsylvania. And it mimics
So when the Supreme Court
composition.
upheld Wisconsin's gerrymandered map, why is, like, there are these conflicts with gerrymandering?
Well, because the Supreme Court didn't actually necessarily uphold Wisconsin's map.
Did they strike down Wisconsin's gerrymandered maps?
No, they opted out
Okay,
of the system
let's
on a
move on.
standing technicality. They didn't
So,
come to a conclusion.
on
You can
this,
read the opinion. They didn't come to a conclusion about whether or
Okay.
not the map was gerrymandered. They addressed it on a standing issue.
So, when people, like, you go back to, like, the old times of slavery and William Lloyd Garrison, which people were allowed to vote back then?
Citizens.
Who were deemed as citizens?
White men at that point.
Why? Why couldn't black people vote?
Because they were disenfranchised by the Constitution.
By the state?
Yes.
So, when people don't vote, they could be disenfranchised by the state that's supposed to protect them.
That occurs in the past.
Why can it not occur in the future? When you see voter ID laws, you see gerrymandering. Isn't this just another instance of voter suppression?
So we made a couple of arguments. First, your plan doesn't solve gerrymandering, so gerrymandering flows neg. When it comes to voter ID laws,
How does it flow neg? Do we increase gerrymandering?
no, but gerrymandering prevents you from solving the representational issues.
So,
It's a
okay, so we don't increase gerrymandering. Voter ID laws exist now. Voter purges exist now. Mandatory voting would make those people have to vote. Those things go away.
So 2 arguments. First of all, it's a question of what's intrinsic to the structure of compulsory voting. Second, and I imagine y'all are from Florida, so you're familiar with what happened with Amendment 4, when there was an amendment passed to enfranchise felons, and then Republican majorities at the state level were able to twist it to their advantage. There's no guarantee that can't happen with a federal compulsory voting law. For example, you can pass compulsory voting and also have voter purges. You can pass compulsory voting
How
and
can you
still
purge?
maintain.
Okay, never mind.
No
So,
worries.
so going back to this.
Force people to re-register.
Going back to this framing.
Sure.
If you don't allow people to vote, the state's supposed to protect them. What happens to those people?
I think the question misunderstands the fact that it's not a consequentialist framing, right? So questions of consequentialist results are not even relevant to the framing in the first place.
anybody not ready? The status quo is disenfranchising voters, leading and shutting people out of the system. The negative provides you no alternative solution, which means that in the status quo, these policies are only going to persist. This is not a policy debate round, and you should not evaluate this debate based on evidence from 2012 and 2002. You need to evaluate this debate on what is actually happening based on outside consequences that we all know to be true. There is mass polarization in the status quo. We have never seen media that is more biased and more focused on promoting this polarization. The media madness that they are talking about is exactly what's happening now. You turn on CNN, you turn on Fox News, every day there's a new prediction of who is going to win the primaries. This is horse race journalism. It cannot get worse than it already is now. There is only a risk that the affirmative creates more moderate policies and that it creates more representation to create an attitudinal shift that fundamentally changes the way in which our system is structured. The arguments about gerrymandering our primaries are already existing in the status quo. Gerrymandering is locking out voters now. There is only a risk that the affirmative creates policies in which people are more informed to vote out of politicians that are structuring systems to leave them out. Gerrymandering and primaries will always restrict things in the status quo. The fact that both sides agree that this is going to be a problem means that there's no reason that this should take out any solvency of the affirmative. We make arguments about both agency and representation. The negative has fundamentally not disputed the fact that agency is a prerequisite to freedom, which means even under their framework, if people are unable to access the system or to access the system to vote, they do not have the freedom to choose to vote or not to choose or not to vote, which means that the only way that you can access this freedom is by giving people agency. Our first affirmative speech talks about how these people view voting as inaccessible and see themselves as not competent to do so, to participate, which means that based on the structure of this advantage, we see that because of increased education, because of increased civic engagement, these people can only access this sort of freedom by being given agency via compulsory voting. Which means that if we win that structural obstacles in the status quo are preventing people from voting now, and then the affirmative is therefore decreasing obstructions of freedom of speech by enabling people to have the option to vote by decreasing barriers. We are not forcing Native Americans to submit a ballot for a specific candidate. We are just saying that we should have a system in which everybody should go to the polls. They're given a ballot. They can submit a blank ballot. This is called a protest vote, which means that we access all of the arguments that the negative is making while still net decreasing structural barriers for the rest of the population, especially marginalized groups. We need to weigh the access of minorities and marginalized populations not being able to access the system at all over the very, very, very small percentage of the population that sees the complete excuse from interacting with the government as something in which they're entitled to. It's the option of giving the people the option to have an out via submitting the blank ballot versus completely continuing to shut out people of the system. These things are fundamentally incompatible and they flow affirmative. This blank ballot is empirically proven. It happens in Australia, it happens in Austria. They're not explaining the truth. Plus, when evaluating the other parts on this, the model in which the negative is advocating for, we see is one in which cross-text proves is one that allows for policies that hurt marginalized people. Slavery existed because black people did not have the right to vote out those politicians. The status quo is dangerously getting close to such issues. When marginalized populations are not able to access the system because they don't have agency to, we see more polarization. That is the status quo. There is polarization, and the only way that we can give these people agency is through the affirmative. The affirmative outlines this attitudinal shift that should structure all negative arguments and also over the overarching theme of this debate. The negative has not contested the fact that overall compulsory voting changes a shift in the attitudes of the citizenry. There's changes in systems this shift leads to changes in the system to decrease effects like gerrymandering and polarization. People become more educated and become more politically active. That's what our Shepherd evidence talks to you about in systems of compulsory voting. Because when people are told that their voice matters, they become more interested in voting. They try to make the worst policies out. They try to say that this leads to worse policies, but this is not true. Because education solves back for this. We know that people, once they're told your voice matters, care about how their voice is heard, and therefore only make better policies. And at the point in which the negative frames these policies as bad, you have to ask, is it better that at least these people get a choice to choose their representation and choose the outcome for themselves?
My opponent gets up here and try to make up all of these arguments about what is happening in the status quo. However, Patrick and I would like to say that the status quo doesn't matter. And you can imagine a world in which the current system could solve back for these issues. Imagine a world in which voter turnout IDs don't exist. They only happen in 9 states. Imagine a world where, look, an African-American woman in Alabama going against Roy Moore, right? There is a world where you don't have to mandate people to vote and better outcomes happen. And additionally, in terms of like time frame and severity, in 200 years from now, we might not have the same system or the same political consequences that exist now. So you always prioritize political philosophy because that's the most everlasting and is based on the intrinsic nature of the policy themselves. That is why all of their arguments about how the status quo is bad, if there's any belief in your mind that the status quo could get better, and also the fact that they can't even solve for like a lot of these issues like the primary process or gerrymandering, you always prioritize impacts as to the intrinsicness of the policy itself. With that said though, then go to the reasons as to why it's intrinsically a good or a bad idea. There's 2 reasons as to why this is true. The first is that non-voting is a negative right? Essentially, all of their arguments about jury duty, etc., are not responded to the fact that not voting itself is a form of a right. Now, they try to come up here and make a couple of responses. So they talk about how you can submit a blank ballot and that you can access all of these arguments. That is not true because a lot of the individuals, first of all, in Australia, you can't just submit, there's no option to like vote none of the above. But secondly, the William Lloyd Garrison evidence specifically indicates that they protest the ballot itself. They protest the institutional structures associated with the government. They protest the fact that they even have to go to the polls in the first place. At the point where that is true, we give other examples about Native Americans and trans rights, especially, and then also at the point where we are probably winning the framework or the lens in which you view the debate about how this philosophy comes first. You prioritize the long-term interests associated with freedom. Additionally, they also try to make this argument that you could solve back for a lot of these issues and that agency is a prerequisite. But again, agency is not a prerequisite. Prioritize the structural impacts associated with the intrinsicness of the policy. If the intrinsicness of the policy is bad, that's a reason to vote negative. negative, because in 200 years from now, we might not have the same questions. If there's a world in which these policies don't exist, it's contingent but not necessary. Then, on their case. So they say that the status quo is toward disenfranchisement, but there's two arguments that they don't really respond to. The first of which is the Brookings Institution evidence, that right now the status quo is shifting towards more representation, particularly that minorities are outgrowing the white people, and that they're becoming a greater share of the electorate. But then the second evidence is the Brennan evidence. Right? There's a reason why we don't have a direct democracy. We elect people who represent the interests of the broader United States. And we say the Brennan evidence, based on survey data of non-voters and voters, is that there is the same levels of representation. At the point where that is true, empty rhetoric is cheap, but they don't essentially prove to you that there's any sort of difference in electoral outcomes. Then, additionally, the only impact that they really have going for you is this idea of representative policies. At the point where that is true, they have not once responded to the ABC poll evidence that found that 72% of Americans oppose compulsory voting. If you want representative policies, it does not start with passing a policy that is not representative of the interest of America. Additionally, that is a reason as to why you should essentially vote negative in this round, because they don't solve for that issue and they don't even respond to it in this round. Additionally, they have also not responded to the idea of Australia, is that why was this implemented in the first place? It was not implemented as a means to increase representation, it was implemented as a means to stop the pro-labor, pro-union members in Australia. That was another conceded analysis, and that it only led to the further subjugation of rights of individual workers in Australia, which led to worse outcomes. Then, they also say a lot of these issues about how it results in a quote-unquote attitudinal shift. Again, prioritize empirical evidence. So there's a couple of pieces of evidence you're going to prefer. The James DiNardo evidence of Princeton University is really good because it is an experiment where they test the hypothesis of whether or not individuals were coerced or forced into voting. And they found that all voters, right? So even if right now you go out to the polls and you seek information, at the point where you're forced to vote, you seek less information. And this applies and outweighs probably on scope because we're affecting both voters and non-voters. So just it's pretty true, like logically as well, right? Like if you're forced to do something, you don't want to do that, even if you found intrinsic joy in doing that in the first place. So on net, it results in less quality representation, and so all of the rhetoric about this attitudinal shift is not actually manifested in reality. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, we also look at the Singh of the University of Georgia evidence, who actually found that it fosters political apathy, right? And this is also really important, because they only talked about people who are disenfranchised, but again, we showed that in places like Alabama, these disenfranchised voters that they talk about have the capacity to vote, and it's not intrinsic to the system itself, but also that it's getting better, but also that it fosters apathy and anti-democratic sentiment. So if you care about representative democracy, it's probably not good that you have a bunch of people in your population that significantly oppose democracy, and at the point where this policy just is a panacea for quote-unquote representative policies, it doesn't actually do anything. Now,